My guest is Paul Merkley. He's a former professor of history at Carleton University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, Paul, you have a specialty in Christian history, the history of Christianity in North America. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. Mm-hmm.
And a particular interest in the evangelical community?
That's part of it, yes. Mm-hmm.
But you cover the whole gamut.
Oh, yes, I've taught seminars on religion in American history.
And you've written books on the topic as well.
I've written 3 books on aspects of Israel, American attitudes towards Israel, Christian attitudes towards Israel, and political attitudes towards Israel. Israel is the linchpin of my interest.
Okay. Well, we're going to show evangelical movies and discuss them, but not the usual ones. These are evangelicals who are critical of Israel.
Correct.
So what I want to do is show a clip from that film, a 3-minute clip from God is on Our Side is the name of the film, and then we'll discuss it. So we'll throw it to the film and then come back to the discussion.
I repeat, we cannot change the past. But Christians and Jews can unite, and we can control the future. 50 million evangelicals with 5 million Jewish people in North America is a match made in heaven.
Biblical Zionism is the belief that the Abrahamic covenant, either in part or in full, has never been abolished.
The Bible is very clear in Joel 3:2 about not dividing the land.
It is the only country in the world where God actually outlined its borders and parameters and gave it that land.
This is one of those areas where we're standing on firm biblical soil.
Therefore, we don't question the Word of God, we just obey it.
So if there are political ramifications, okay, so what?
يعني فيش ولا عقل هيك ممكن تقعدي تسمعي له يستوعب شو اللي بيصير.
You don't want attacks in Tel Aviv, you don't want attacks in Haifa. Of course, every state has the right to self-defense, but you don't build a wall on other people's property.
Many of the human rights violations that are taking place in the West Bank flow from the government's interest in protecting and perpetuating the settlement enterprise.
So, I don't know, does supporting Israel mean that we fully support every one of those policies?
What has happened is that we as evangelicals have endorsed an Israeli domestic policy that has placed over 3 million people under military occupation and has created the largest refugee population in the entire world. And you have to ask yourself, why is this defended by the Christian church? How is it that we don't see the suffering of so many people who are made in the image of God?
Our theological position are putting us for one group of people against other group of people. For the Jews against the Palestinians, or for the Palestinians against the Jews. And that's wrong. I am promoting and saying theology of reconciliation, a theology where the justice the Palestinians are seeking will be met and the hope the Jews are looking for will be met.
Now, Paul, that's only a sample of the film, but what do you think of the film? What's your perspective on it?
Well, I have found the hard way that Jews have an awful lot of trouble sorting out Christian attitudes towards Israel. On the one hand, most of the major Christian churches, particularly those of the World Council of Churches, are adamantly anti-Israel. They've signed on to the Durban Defamation of Israel, and most of them, on the 60th anniversary of the creation of the State of Israel, boycotted pro-Israel occasions and instead held Nakba remembrances in Europe and in Israel. This is pretty shocking stuff and pretty mean. On the other hand, we know from polling and from other good and reliable sources that most Christians in the pews, if they're polled about this, are very solidly pro-Israel on their attitudes. This comes out again and again and again. And the more colorful demonstrations of this are in groups, volunteer groups who are committed to support of Israel, Christian Zionists. And there's a long tradition of Christian Zionism. In fact, the tradition of Christian Zionism is longer than the tradition of Jewish Zionism.
Yes, I discovered that
Yeah.
when I did research on
This
Joel.
always comes as a
Surprise! It's totally surprised.
Yes,
I
that's
didn't even
true.
know. I actually didn't even know there was Christian. That's how ignorant I was.
Well, we'll work on that.
But no, I've learned quite a bit since. But that was a long time ago. But in the film, it starts with sort of the Christian Zionist evangelical position, but then moves into not very subtle, critiques of Israel. It says that Christian Zionists support the settlement policy. Do Christian Zionists support settlements?
Essentially, yes.
They do.
Essentially, yeah. With reservations here and there, but essentially they do.
So anywhere the Jews can settle anywhere in the West Bank freely?
Well, I think prior to that is that Christian Zionists, like the Prime Minister of Israel, reject the notion of settlement that where Jews have chosen to live and to build houses and to live is a settlement, where Arabs have chosen to build houses and live is a village. And within our reasonable understanding of what belongs to Israel and what is, for the time being, in dispute, Christian Zionists solidly support what has been accomplished already in Jewish communities in the West Bank, and I think that's the bottom line.
Well, when I interviewed the head of the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem, he told me, I asked him about this question, and he said, our bottom line is we're for a united Jerusalem.
Correct.
But whatever the government of Israel decides about the West Bank is the government of Israel's position.
Yeah, that would be my view.
It would be your view.
That would be my view. We reject the notion that any part of Jerusalem is a settlement. That is the bottom line to that.
Well, I'll have to interview you about that separately, but I want to finish with the film.
Yeah.
Because the film concentrates on settlements and refugees. And the settlement issue, I was in Al-Quds University conference with Palestinians, and leader of Fatah, a student leader of Fatah, it was a girl who was a law student, said, well, the settlements can stay. They can be citizens of Palestine just as Jews, just as Arabs or Palestinians are citizens of Israel, same thing. So her issue wasn't the settlements. It was that if Israel wanted the land and denied the state of Palestine, that was her issue. Is that your perspective?
I don't know of any politician in the broad light of day that gets voted by anybody in the state of Israel who rejects the notion that ultimately there's going to be a two-state solution.
But the film doesn't imply that.
No, it does not.
The film suggests that it's all imperialism, that they're out to take, the settlements are a vehicle to take over the West Bank.
The original solution of the Palestine Mandate problem was a two-state solution, as you know. And the United Nations met in November 1947, and they signed on to a very elaborate plan with maps attached that there would be two states, one a Jewish state and the other an Arab state, not a Palestinian state, an Arab state. The Jews said yes, the Arabs said no. The Jews said yes, although the dimensions of the state to which they said yes were approximately half the size of the dimensions that would eventually emerge after all those wars. That was the original two-state solution. But somehow or other the rhetoric and the propaganda has turned this around to the position where the United States, where Israel is presented as having rejected the two-state solution. It's the other side that rejects the two-state solution.
Well, one of the things that comes out in the film is that Israel was just alone responsible for producing the refugees, and Israel wasn't attacked. But we have no more time. We'll have to wind it up. We'll take a break and we'll discuss the other film we want to discuss.
Excellent.
Both my grandparents came from Eastern Europe. They went to build their dream. 15 years later, they established the State of Israel.
My grandparents escaped and left the village after the Haganah attack in 1948. My mother was 1 year old.
My grandfather was killed by a sniper bullet.
A Palestinian suicide bomber blew himself up in a crowded Jerusalem street.
The Israelis' assassination campaign has killed at least 12 Palestinian militants.
One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream.
To be strong is not something to be ashamed of, but the message that you bring out is what is more important. For Martin Luther King, it was a message of nonviolence, a message of equality.
And we felt that as Israelis, we are actually joining the Palestinian non-violent struggle for liberation.
So for me, non-violence is how much you are treating others as a human being, then you are a human being.
He was developing a message of nonviolence for the world.
Because the bullets of a gun do not differentiate between Jew, Christian and Muslim, between white and black.
Paul, this is a film that takes a very different critical attitude, and unlike the other one, which is, I think, clearly biased, this one seems to be critical of both positions of violence and taking a pacifist stand. Well, how did you read that film?
I found it very, very difficult to handle that. The thing they propose is that on the side of Israel there's violence and resort to arms, and all the images that have to do with Israel are military, and they are soldiers with shields and pushing and shoving and so on. And we're told that on the other side, the solution is peaceful demonstrations and peaceful attitudes, and this is represented by Palestinians with characters in the kafia and so on. There's no acknowledgement that the overwhelming input into this conflict on the other side is violent. It's as if Fatah didn't exist, as though Hamas didn't exist. I don't know how to deal with the argument of a film like that. It deals entirely in images. It's like a commercial. There's jangling images and music over, and you're supposed to carry away a notion that you've been persuaded about something. For instance, right at the beginning, there's this juxtaposition of images of the Palestinian, the oppressed Palestinian, a peaceful soul, and Martin Luther King. And we're given a few words from Martin Luther King's speech about having a dream, which is a wonderful speech. And you're to carry away from that the notion that the enemies of Martin Luther King are the enemies of the Palestinians. There's that view of life. Martin Luther King was a zealous Zionist, very zealous Zionist. You can look up an essay called Letters to an Anti-Zionist Friend, which he wrote in July of 1967, right after the 67 war, in which he says, you, my good friend, claim that you can make a distinction between being anti-Zionist and being anti-Semitic. And he says very categorically, you cannot be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. He says that in this present ethos, it's not comfortable to make explicitly anti-Judaic arguments. So the same old stuff, the same old hostility towards Jews and Judaism is dusted off and presented as a political theory, anti-Zionism. And he couches this in very, very, very glowing rhetoric about the desire of the Jewish people for a state, and how he identifies that with the desire of the many African nations for a state of their own. And he says quite categorically, friends of African nationalism must recognize that the pioneer in this whole business of creating a nation state for people who have not had one previously is Israel. There's no way that you can reconcile anti-Zionism and hostility to Jews.
I respond. I don't disagree with you at all, but I respond slightly differently.
Yeah.
Faisal Husseini, who was a friend when he was alive, was trying, before the first Intifada, was trying to organize a non-violent protest movement on for the Palestinians against the occupation. And he had assembled the work of all the non-violent movement, and we were having discussions about it. And then the Intifada broke up. Now, from that film, you'd never know there was an Intifada.
Absolutely.
They identify explicitly the Palestinian movement as a non-violent movement, which is what you said. And so you have this playing down that we're fair, and yet the imagery isn't fair. And yet it says we have three, one for a Palestinian, one Christian, one Muslim, one Jew, and they're all non-violent. And therefore they are opposed to everybody, but the pictures tell a different story. So I was seeing it more from the angle of that memory of a real attempt to have a non-violent movement, which is a total failure. It never got off the ground.
I have no quarrel with that. The Jewish spokesman on this, as on other films of this same kind, are always persons who have to some degree or another rejected Zionism, or rejected the state, or rejected the position of governments of the State of Israel over the last 40 or 50 years, and who resort to a purely pacifist rhetoric. Now, these are very honorable people, some of them, but there's no way you can possibly present them as typical of Israelis. There's no effort to take account of the responsible middle of Israeli politics.
Yeah, you get the sense that, if you just get rid of arms, they'd all live lovingly together. And therefore the people who built the wall, which they show, are the people who are responsible for the divisiveness.
It's an old argument, and Abel was the first one to fall for it by neglecting the brother with a big rock.
I never made that connection. But what is going on? Is there a significant movement among evangelicals that are anti-Israel, or is this a minor fringe group?
It's become a serious phenomenon.
Oh, it
now,
is?
Partly it's a problem of definition. The term evangelical is being constantly redefined. And to say that a person is an evangelical Christian is about as precise to say that someone is an observant Jew. There are many distinctions within it, many positions within it. There's a tradition within American church history, the evangelical tradition. It comes out of revival Christianity, and it's based upon the expectation that individual Christians will read the scripture and base their political positions upon them. It's revivalist, and it's based upon a high view of scripture. That used to be the original meaning. Now an evangelical Christian, people call themselves evangelical Christians who simply do not belong to the traditional mainline churches, the Methodist Church, the Anglican Church, and so on. So their claim to be evangelical is based upon their belonging to traditions that originated in the revival tradition. But those churches, the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, and so on, their laity, their leadership has moved far away from revivalist positions. They generally disdain revivalism, and they generally disdain religious television and so on. But they've kept the label of evangelical because they feel uncomfortable identifying themselves as members of mainline denominations, Methodist, Anglican, and so on.
I'm glad you clarified that.
Well, this is in-house stuff. I don't know how much of this
it's important
most Jews care about.
Well, you have to understand the context, and you've clarified that.
Oh, good.
We've run out of time,
Good.
And we'll have you on again, and thank you.
I look forward to that.
My guest is Paul Workley. He's a professor of history at Carleton University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
You're also an expert on Christianity in North America. And I want to talk to you, though, about the Christian attitudes to Jerusalem.
Yes.
The very different attitudes, and especially in light of the recent information that's come out about the Palestinians agreeing to let the Israelis have what are so-called the settlements in Jerusalem. And also in light of my interview with the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem, where he said that the bottom position of the ICEJ is that Jerusalem should remain united. Is that still their position?
Yes, it is. It is their position. You need to have a little bit of historical background to this very, very complex question. But in 1947, when the United Nations agreed to a partition of the Palestine Mandate, there was to be a Jewish state and an Arab state, not a Palestinian state, an Arab state. But within that, there was to be a Jerusalem as an open city was the context. It wouldn't belong to either of these states, but because it had the churches in it and other religious institutions, it was just thought to be too provocative to assign it to one side or the other. Neither did they divide it and say one side would go to the Jews, the other side to the Arabs, but instead it would have an international status. Now this was supported by the Roman Catholic Church because it allowed them a kind of a cockpit or a position from which they rather hoped to be the largest Christian presence in Israel. Now
Can I give you some background on that myself?
Please. Yeah.
I've done work on the United Nations Commission.
Oh, yes.
That reported and recommended partition.
Really?
There was an 11-person commission.
Yeah.
One of the representatives from South America was a very religious Catholic. In order to get his vote, when you read the minutes,
That's right.
for partition, he pushed a separate jurisdiction for Jerusalem. That's part of the background
That's
of
right.
that.
We're called Corpus Separatum.
That's right.
And the Vatican signed on to that. Now, when the dust, but during the course of the Arab-Israel War of 1948-1949, the Kingdom of Jordan and its army seized a large part of Jerusalem, including the Old City, and also what people now call the Arab sections of the city. And so they disdained the notion of it becoming a separate polity. So that at the end of the war, Israel was in a possession of part of the city, Jordan was in possession of part of the city, and the idea of a corpus separatum was kaput forever. There was no way of putting this back together.
Do you know the story of when the United Nations came in to take over as the Corpus Separatum?
Yeah.
They came into the city, and the Jordanians and the Israelis paid no attention.
That's right.
And they couldn't do anything.
They just sat there and they do as most UN bodies do. They played cards and put their time in, but they had no impact on the issue at all. So nowadays, I think people who come from where I come from regard this as essentially providential because it put forever to rest the notion that Jerusalem could be a peaceful city unless there was a sovereignty over it, and that Israel had proved its right to sovereignty by its very benign government and its very enlightened attitude towards the religious establishment. Nowadays there's an awful lot of nonsense talk about how Jerusalem is a city equally holy to all three faiths. This is nonsense. Jerusalem does not appear anywhere in the Quran, neither by name nor by indirection. The only little shred that Muslim authorities use to claim that it ought to belong to them is a story that the Prophet, in a night vision, not in person but in a night vision, a kind of out-of-body experience, came to the furthest mosque, it says, the furthest eastern mosque. Now, Jerusalem was not a mosque at that time. There weren't any mosques anywhere. But the story is told he went there on his horse, the one with the peacock's feather, and he was taken in a night vision up to heaven. And if you go to the Dome of the Rock today, the tour guides will take you there, and you can put your hand into the part where the horse's hoof makes an indentation. And it's on this places that the Muslims claim that it has been spiritually preempted But everything's been spiritually emptied by Islam. Rome is spiritually preempted by Islam. So there is no historical connection whatever between the prophet and Jerusalem. And throughout the subsequent centuries, until this century, Islamic authorities showed no interest whatever in Jerusalem, and the political authorities, like the Ottomans, showed no interest in whatever. It was only after Israel, the state was created, and Israel established its presence there, that this notion was invented that Islam has a stake in Jerusalem, that for them it's equally important as it is for the Jews and the Christians. For the Jews, it's their only holy site. The Western Wall, all that remains of what used to be their holy site, that is their single, they don't have a second site. The Muslims claim it is the third most important Muslim site. Well, what's the fourth? What's the fifth? What's the sixth? What's the seventh? For the Jews, there's only the one.
But there's a whole other aspect, the politics of it. Because that's why I brought in the Palestinian Papers. Because the way it's being portrayed is the Palestinians have been very conciliatory. They've given in the Jews could have the settlements that were in areas that were captured in the Six-Day War. And they even are giving up one area, which is an Arab area, because it connects parts of the Jewish sector. And so they're being conciliatory, and therefore the Jews, and not coming to an agreement when they're being conciliatory and dividing Jerusalem, are the stubborn and recalcitrant ones.
Well, I think we may be presuming too much when we assume those papers are authentic. They have been disputed. They are being disputed today. But in any case, all they do is represent some tactical and tentative concessions about a part of the city which the Jews quite rightly recognize cannot be governed in a canton way. It must be governed. It must have one sovereign authority, one sovereign police, one sovereign other authority, one sovereign municipal authority. So I don't take that very seriously.
But if the issue came down to that we can have peace if you divide, and if the Muslims got control of the eastern part of Jerusalem, evangelicals and perhaps some other Christians, or most evangelicals, would say, no, that's not a good deal. And some Israelis would say that's not a good deal. And you would think that's a just position to take?
It would create a dilemma for Christian Zionists if the Jewish authorities conceded a part of Israel to some other sovereignty. There have been occasions in the past when Israeli governments have taken actions that the Christian embassy did not approve of, and for instance, the withdrawal from Gaza. We thought that was wrong. We thought it was a tactical mistake. I think we've been vindicated in that, right? But we did not denounce the government. We said the government, which has custody of the care of its own people, should not be second-guessed by us. And if they decide to give a portion of the city to the Muslims, that would be their decision. We should respect it. We sure to goodness hope they wouldn't.
I see. So if they did it, you'd respect it.
Of course we would.
But your urging them would be, don't give it back.
Correct. Just as we urged against their withdrawal from Gaza. To no
but
effect.
That's a different, because that was a tactical one, saying, you know, what happened, you didn't endorse Israel keeping Gaza,
Not
did you?
really. No.
So whereas you endorse Israel keeping all of Jerusalem.
It's a much stronger issue. We feel much more strongly about that than Gaza, because the Jewish religious authorities, by and large, as I understand, have never insisted that Gaza was part of Eretz Israel in the beginning. So, you know, the tactical aspect of that is quite conspicuous. But still, it's a matter of whether anything can be gained by tactical concessions, and I think the Gaza experience proves that it can't.
You'd carry the same view, I guess, about the West Bank, then?
Yes.
Even though they're, by and large, trying to build an orderly and peaceful state, that it's too easily undermined or changed? Is that the reason?
Israel is prepared, as I understand, has always been prepared to remove from parts of what is called the West Bank, okay? Parts that they do not feel are vital to their security. But the perimeter, they feel they cannot concede, because the perimeter would be alongside the borders of states which would be sovereign and would become hostile, undoubtedly. Okay, so there's
We'll
not
have
this-
to wind up with that.
Let's do.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry to cut you off.
Well, that's
but,
all right.
We ran out of time.
Very good.
Thanks very much, Paul.
Very good, thank you.
My guest is Paul Merkley. He's a professor of history at Carleton. Paul, you're an expert on Christian Zionism. Would you agree with that?
Well, I'm on the history of it, yes.
Now, explain to our audience what Christian Zionism is.
Well, the best definition I can give you is in an anecdote, and this is a historical anecdote. And in December of 1953, after Harry Truman was out of the White House for about 6 months, there was a conference at the Hebrew Theological Seminary, I believe in New York, and the guest speaker was the chief rabbi of Israel. And Harry Truman's friend Jacobson brought him and introduced him to the chief rabbi. And he said to the chief rabbi, I want to introduce you to one of the people who made possible the creation of the state of Israel. And Harry Truman said, what do you mean one of the people? I am Cyrus.
Did he actually?
Oh, yes, he did. Oh, this is
an actual
well
story.
documented. Absolutely well
I didn't even
documented.
know that story.
Now, not every one of your listeners will know who Cyrus is,
No,
because we live in an age in which people don't read much history. But Cyrus was the tyrant of Persia, who decided that in order to be at peace with all the gods that there are, he would send the people of Israel back to Jerusalem and exhort them to build their temple, and he would pay them to build the temple and to make it prosperous. So he goes down over the centuries as the symbol, the archetype of the benevolent Christian who would create the circumstances for the restoration of the state. And Harry Truman cried when the chief rabbi said to him, quoting the book of Esther, Mordecai in the book of Esther, who knows but that you were put in your mother's womb for such a moment of this, and he cried.
But the thing is about Harry Truman, he wasn't a Christian Zionist,
Yes,
was
he
he?
was.
He was?
Absolutely he was.
Okay, then
right.
you have to enlighten me, because as I understood it, I mean, he certainly had his friend Jacobson, who was his partner in the haberdashery
Eddie Jacobson
business.
has come to me finally.
Yeah. Who was his partner in the haberdashery business, was a friend. But the key turning point, I understood, when Ben Gurion went to see him, he thought he was a jerk and wouldn't have anything to do with him and wouldn't support him. And it's only when Jacobson got him to see Ezer Weitzman that Ezer Weitzman, he was so impressed with Ezer that he switched. Isn't that the story, or have I got it wrong?
Harry Truman had always believed in what is called Christian restorationism. That is the theory that derives from study of the prophets of the Old Testament. He went to Sunday school, Baptist Sunday school, and they taught this, that it was in the prophets that there would come a day when the people of Israel would be restored to the land of Israel, and there would be a nation of Israel. But this would not be accomplished until Christian statesmen made themselves available to cooperate with this. And Harry Truman saw himself in that light. He saw himself as Cyrus Redivivus. And it wasn't arrogance, it wasn't delusion. It's just that he'd read a lot of history, he'd read a lot of Bible, and he saw that the Bible and the history reinforced each other with overwhelming proof that the restoration of the Jews would create the solution for the problem of the Jews that had escaped the people of the Jews for 18th, 19th centuries.
Well, let me ask you about another part of Harry Truman, because you know the history better than I do. When he had the fight with Marshall, when Marshall undercut him when he went on holiday, and the State Department went back to proposing a trusteeship and did the undercutting. And he came back, and I remember reading his diaries, and he was just furious. He was furious that the pinstripers had double-crossed him when he was away.
That's right.
And therefore, he decided to recognize Israel as the first country that did, just because of what the State Department did, and take the rug out from under
That's the
them.
context, and it's very important that you bring that up. Harry Truman, in making this decision, rejected the overwhelming advice of his Secretary of Defense, his Secretary of State, whom he admired.
Yeah, he was a friend of Marshall's.
Oh, he admired him more than
great.
anybody else in the world.
Yeah.
He said he's the greatest statesman of our time. And Marshall opposed him. And at a famous meeting where they're discussing what to do about this, Marshall turned on Truman very insubordinately and said, if you do this, and if you decide for re-election, and if I vote, which I doubt that I will do, I will vote against you. And there was a deathly hush went around the room because it was a terribly insubordinate thing to say. And Truman knew what that meant. If Marshall quit, the last shred of credibility that he had would collapse. Nonetheless, and despite of that, he decided to reject the advice of Marshall, to reject the advice of virtually the whole upper tier of people, because in his heart he knew it was right.
There's another dimension about Christian Zionism that I learned when I was studying why Joe Clark putting the embassy into Jerusalem, which was that Christian Zionism predates Jewish Zionism.
Oh, heavens, yes.
It was something I had to learn. I should have known. I don't know why I was so ignorant, but I was. And that it goes back into the 19th century and earlier even in some senses. But that was an important element behind the Balfour Declaration.
The historical philosophy, which is called Christian Restorationism, which comes out of a certain interpretation of scriptures, that it's in the gears, it's in history that the Jews will be restored. That was promoted from the Reformation forward, but it really came into focus as a political force in the United States in 1892, when there was an American preacher named Blackstone who put together a petition, and he got a majority of all the members of Congress, a majority of all the senators, a majority of the Supreme Court, and virtually everybody who was anybody to sign on to this presentation, which they made to President Harrison, that he should seek diplomacy with the Ottoman Empire in order to create a state of Israel. And that's called the Blackstone Petition. Now that predates 1893. That predates by 3 or 4 years the Herzl's book.
But even 30 years earlier in Britain, you have
Shaftesbury.
Yeah, Lord Shaftesbury, and you have that whole movement.
Yeah.
And the heirs of that movement become involved with the Balfour Declaration. So people who think it's just the pressure of Jews on some government. No. There's a whole other source of stream to this.
Yeah. There's a line you could draw. Blackstone, Heckler, who was the friend of Herzl, and who opened the door for him to meet the Kaiser, who opened the door for him to meet many British statesmen. Balfour, Lord Balfour, who was the father of the Balfour Declaration. These were all Christian restorationists, Christian Zionists. And the long sequence, and Harry Truman's in that sequence.
And my discovery, but learning that behind the movement of the embassy to Jerusalem was not the Jewish lobby.
No.
It wasn't nothing to do with that. It wasn't some kind of insult against Joe's wife, Joe Clark's wife, as some people told me. But in fact, there were a group in the Tory party who believed in this restorationism. And that was very interesting to learn that's part of our conservative party history. Well, with that, I want to thank you very much for being on the show again, and I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
Both my grandparents came from Eastern Europe. They went to build their dream. 15 years later, they established the State of Israel.
My grandparents escaped and left the village after the Haganah attack in 1948. My mother was 1 year old.
My grandfather was killed by a sniper bullet.
A Palestinian suicide bomber blew himself up in a crowded Jerusalem street.
The Israelis' assassination campaign has killed at least 12 Palestinian militants.
One day right bad in Alabama, little black boys and black
To be strong is not something to be ashamed of, but the message that you bring out is what is more important. For Martin Luther King, it was a message of nonviolence, a message of equality.
And we felt that as Israelis, we are actually joining the Palestinian non-violent struggle for liberation.
So for me, non-violence is how much you are treating others as a human being, then you are a human being.
He was developing a message of nonviolence for the world.
Because the bullets of a gun do not differentiate between Jew, Christian and Muslim, between white and black.
Israel in the Jewish world values diversity and equality, explores cultural strengths and struggles, and promotes understanding and acceptance. We hope we've succeeded. We welcome comments, criticisms, ideas. Please drop us a line. We also welcome new members. Join us. I hope you'll tune in next week. I'm Howard Edelman. Good night until then.